They said no child could walk that far into the desert and still be breathing by sundown. But they were wrong. The wind moved first, dragging thin lines of dust across the open land like whispers no one wanted to hear. And out beyond the last fence post where the road disappeared into nothing, there were footprints, small ones, uneven, the kind that didn't belong to anyone who knew where they were going. And back in town, men stood in the shade of the general store, shaking their heads, saying it didn't make sense, saying no child survives alone out there past a mile, let alone 5, not with the heat pressing down like a weight and the silence stretching for miles in every direction. But Ethan Cole didn't wait for their guessing, didn't stay for their doubt, because he had already seen something they hadn't, something most men would have ridden past without a second glance. And now he rode alone toward the edge of where maps stopped meaning anything, his horse moving steady beneath him, hooves pressing into dry earth that hadn't seen rain in weeks, the sun hanging low but still sharp enough to cut through the air. And when he finally found her, she wasn't crying the way they said she would be, wasn't calling out or stumbling toward him like lost children are supposed to do. She was sitting still, right there in the open, like she had run out of reasons to move, her dress torn at the hem, dust clinging to her skin, her small boots half buried where she had stopped walking, and her eyes, quiet, too quiet, lifted to meet his like she had already measured the world and found nothing left to expect from it. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, something old, something he had buried years ago beneath work and distance and long silent nights. But he didn't speak right away, didn't reach for her like a man trying to fix something. He just stood there for a second longer than he should have, letting the wind pass between them, carrying the dry scent of sage and sunburned wood. And then he stepped down from the saddle slow, careful, like approaching something fragile that might break if you moved too fast. And when he knelt in front of her, he noticed her hands. First, small fingers wrapped tight around a thin silver chain, knuckles pale from holding on too long. And there was something dark along the metal, something that didn't belong there. But she didn't offer it, didn't explain, just held it like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. And Ethan exhaled once, long and steady, before finally speaking, his voice low, rough from disuse. "You out here alone?" But she didn't answer. Not with words, just a slight shift closer, barely a movement, but enough for a man like Ethan to understand that silence better than most. And for a moment, he looked past her, out into the distance where the horizon shimmered with heat, where anything could be watching, waiting, and he knew then this wasn't just a lost child. This was a story that hadn't finished catching up to itself yet, and men who lived long enough out here learned one thing the hard way. You don't find something like this without something else finding you back. And still, he reached out anyway, slow, steady, and when she didn't pull away, when her grip on that chain loosened just enough for her hand to touch his sleeve, that was all it took. Because out here, sometimes a man doesn't need answers. Sometimes he just needs to decide. And Ethan Cole had already decided before he even realized it. Lifting her carefully, setting her on his saddle, wrapping his coat around her shoulders like it meant something more than warmth, like it meant a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. And as he turned his horse back toward the direction no one else had been willing to ride, the wind shifted again, softer this time, almost like it was carrying something behind them, something distant but real. And though the land stayed quiet, Ethan didn't look back, because he already knew whatever had left those footprints behind wasn't finished yet, and whatever was coming next, it wasn't coming slow. The shack came into view just as the last stretch of sunlight slipped behind the low hills, turning the sky into a dull copper glow that lingered over the land like a warning that refused to fade. And Ethan did not slow his horse until the familiar outline of weathered wood and leaning posts stood between him and the open desert, because out here, distance was not measured in miles, but in how far trouble was willing to follow you. And tonight it felt closer than it should have been, pressing at his back like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. And the girl behind him had not spoken a single word since he lifted her from the dust, not even when the wind grew colder or when the horse shifted beneath her. She only held onto his coat with small, steady fingers, the silver chain still wrapped around her other hand, as if letting go would change something she was not ready to lose. And when Ethan finally stepped down and lifted her gently to the ground, she hesitated for the first time, her eyes moving past him toward the open land behind them, not afraid in the way most children would be, but alert, as if she was listening for something no one else could hear. And that was when Ethan felt it too. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one, the kind of quiet that settles in before something arrives. And he pushed the thought aside, guiding her toward the door, the hinges groaning softly as he opened it, the smell of old wood and ash drifting out to meet them. Familiar, steady, safe in a way the outside world never was. And inside, the space was simple, a narrow bed, a small table, a lantern hanging by a rusted hook. Everything in its place because that was how Ethan kept the past from creeping in. But now there was something new standing. In the middle of it, something that did not belong to the order he had built. And for a moment he just watched her, unsure of what came next, unsure of what this decision would ask of him. And she moved slowly, carefully, like someone stepping into a place they were not sure they were allowed to stay, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, her eyes taking in every corner as if she was measuring it for safety. And Ethan turned away first, reaching for the canteen, pouring water into a tin cup and setting it down in front of her without a word, and she stared at it for a second before lifting it with both hands, drinking. In small, steady sips, not rushed, not desperate, just enough, like she had learned how to make things last. And that quiet control unsettled him more than anything else, because children did not survive like that unless they had been taught. And as she lowered the cup, her grip on the chain loosened just enough for the lantern light to catch it. And Ethan saw it clearly for the first time, a small silver pendant, scratched, worn, but deliberate, the kind of thing that meant something to someone, and whatever had stained it before had dried into a dark mark that would not come out easily. And he did not ask about it, did not reach for it, because some things did not need questions to carry weight. And instead he stepped outside again, just for a moment, just enough to look across the land as the last light disappeared completely, leaving only the faint outline of distant hills under a rising night sky. And that was when he saw it, far off near the ridge, a movement too steady to be wind, too deliberate to be chance. And though it was nothing more than a shadow against a darker line of earth, Ethan knew exactly what it meant, because he had spent enough years out here to recognize the difference between something that wandered and something that searched. And when he stepped back inside and closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch settling into place felt heavier than usual, like it was not just keeping the night out, but holding something in. And the girl looked up at him then, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not match the moment. And for the first time, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying more certainty than fear. "They will not stop." And Ethan did not answer right away, because deep down, he already knew she was not talking about the desert. The lantern flame shifted as if it had heard her words before Ethan did, a small flicker against the still air that made the shadows on the walls stretch and bend like they were listening. And for a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there with one hand resting against the door, feeling the weight of it beneath his palm, the solid wood, the iron latch, the thin line between what was inside and what was not. And then he moved, slow and deliberate, crossing the room to the window where the night pressed close against the glass like a living thing. And he did not open it, did not need to, because he could already read the land the way other men read books. And what he saw was not movement, not yet, but space being claimed, distance closing in ways that did not show themselves all at once. And behind him the girl had not moved either, still standing near the table, the empty tin cup in her hands, the silver chain now resting against her wrist instead of hidden in her grip. And when Ethan finally spoke, his voice came low, steady, like a man who had already stepped into something he could not step back from. "How long have they been following you?" And she did not answer right away, not because she did not understand, but because she was choosing her words carefully, the way someone does when the truth has weight to it. And when she did speak, it was not fear that shaped her voice, it was certainty. "Since before I left." And Ethan turned slightly at that, not fully facing her, but enough to catch the reflection of her in the glass, small, still, but unbroken. And that word settled into the room heavier than anything else, because it meant this was not chance, not bad luck. This was something set in motion long before the dust ever touched her shoes. And he exhaled slowly, his mind already moving ahead of the moment, measuring distances, counting hours, mapping out what could be done and what could not. Because men like Ethan did not survive by reacting. They survived by deciding before the world forced their hand. And yet there was something here he could not measure, something in the way she stood there, not asking, not pleading, just present, like she had already accepted whatever came next, and that unsettled him more than the thought of riders in the dark. Because acceptance like that did not belong to a child, and he turned fully. Then, meeting her eyes, and for the first time there was something in his expression that was not guarded, not distant, something closer to recognition, and he nodded once, not to her, but to the choice he had already made. And he reached for the lantern, lifting it from its hook, the soft glow casting warmer light across the room as he moved toward the small chest by the wall, opening it with a quiet creak that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. And inside were things he had not touched in years, things that belonged to a life he had set down piece by piece until there was nothing left but the silence. And he hesitated for just a second, his hand hovering over the contents, before closing his fingers around what he needed, not looking at anything else, not letting the past reach too far into the present. And when he stood again, the decision had settled into him completely, not heavy, not uncertain, just firm, like ground that would not shift. And he set the lantern back in place, the light steady now, no longer flickering, and walked to the door once more, resting his hand against it again. But this time not to hold it closed, just to feel it, to know where he stood. And behind him the girl spoke again, quieter this time, almost like she was testing whether the words belonged to her. "You should let me go." And Ethan did not turn, did not hesitate. He just gave the smallest shake of his head, a movement so slight it might have been missed if someone had not been watching for it. And his voice came back to her the same way it had before, low, certain, carrying no room for argument. "Not tonight." And outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the lantern light, the night shifted again, not louder, not closer in any way that could be proven, but different, like something had just realized it was not alone in the decision anymore. The night settled deeper around the shack, not louder, not closer in any way a man could measure, but heavier, like the air itself had decided to stay and watch. And Ethan remained by the door a moment longer, listening with something older than his ears, something built from years of knowing when silence meant safety and when it meant waiting. And behind him the soft scrape of wood told him the girl had moved, not far, just enough to sit on the edge of the narrow bed, her small frame barely making an impression on the worn blanket. And when he finally stepped away from the door, he did not rush, did not reach for anything sharp or loud. Instead, he crossed the room with the same steady pace he had used all his life, the kind that said he was not afraid even when fear had already taken its seat somewhere inside him. And he pulled a second chair close to the bed, turning it slightly so he could see both her and the door without choosing between them. And for a while neither of them spoke, the lantern casting a quiet circle of light that did not quite touch the corners of the room, leaving just enough shadow to remind them the world outside was still there, still moving. And Ethan rested his forearms on his knees, hands loosely clasped, eyes on the floorboards as if the answers might be written there in grain and dust. And when he spoke again, it was not a question this time, just a simple truth placed gently between them. "You are not running from the desert." And the girl's fingers tightened slightly around the chain at her wrist, not in fear, but in recognition, and she looked down at it before answering, her voice low, steady, shaped by something that had already taken more from her than most people ever lose. "No." And the word stayed in the room longer than it should have, because it carried everything she did not say with it. And Ethan nodded once, slow, as if he had expected nothing less. And he reached to the small table, pulling it closer with a soft drag against the floor, setting the lantern between them so the light reached her face more clearly. And for the first time he could see what the distance and dust had hidden, not just the tiredness in her eyes, but the way she held herself, straight, quiet, like someone who had learned not to fold even when the world pressed hard. And that told him more than any story could have. And he leaned back slightly, giving her space without stepping away, and said, "Then you can stop running tonight." And she looked at him then, not with hope, not yet, but with something that almost resembled disbelief, like she had heard words like that before, but never from someone who meant them. And she shook her head once, small, controlled. You do not understand. And Ethan let that sit. Did not argue. Because understanding was not something you claimed out here. It was something you proved over time. And he glanced once toward the door, then back to her, and answered simply, maybe not. And for a moment the wind brushed against the walls, a soft, passing sound that carried the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth. And the girl's gaze shifted toward the window, just for a second. Just long enough for Ethan to notice. And he followed it, not seeing anything new, but feeling the same quiet pressure building. And when he looked back at her, she had already returned her attention to the chain, her thumb tracing the edge of the pendant like it held something she could not let go of. And Ethan watched that small movement, that one detail, and made another decision without speaking it aloud, because out here, the smallest things were often the ones that told the truth. And he stood then, slow, unhurried, moving to the corner where a folded blanket rested, bringing it back and setting it beside her without comment. A simple gesture, nothing more, but it changed the air between them just enough to matter, and she looked at it, then at him, and after a moment she nodded once, barely, like she was accepting something she had not expected to be offered. And as she lay back against the bed, still holding that chain, still awake despite the long miles behind her, Ethan returned to the chair, settling into it with a quiet weight, his eyes moving once more to the door, and then to the window, and then back again, the rhythm of a man keeping watch. And outside, somewhere beyond sight, the night held its breath just a little longer, as if waiting to see which one of them would move first. The lantern burned lower as the hours stretched thin, its flame steady but smaller now, casting a softer glow that made the room feel both closer and farther at the same time. And Ethan had not moved from his chair except to shift his weight when the wood beneath him creaked, his eyes never fully closing, not even once, because sleep was something a man gave himself only when the world allowed it. And tonight the world was asking him to stay awake, to listen, to notice the small changes most people would miss, like the way the wind had stopped brushing against the walls and settled into something heavier, something that carried less air and more intent. And across from him the girl lay still, the blanket drawn up to her shoulders, her breathing slow but not deep enough to be sleep. Not yet. Her fingers still curled around that silver chain like it was part of her, and Ethan watched that detail longer than he meant to, because there was something about the way she held it that reminded him of a time he did not let himself visit, a memory tied to loss in quiet places, something he had buried under years of distance. And he looked away before it could take shape, turning his attention back to the door, to the faint line where wood met frame. And that was when he heard it, not loud, not clear, just a shift in the distance, the kind that might have been nothing if a man had not been listening for it. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his body responding before his thoughts had time to catch up, his hand resting on his knee as he focused on the space beyond the walls. And there it was again, a subtle rhythm carried through the ground more than the air, measured, deliberate, and not alone. And he stood then, slow, careful not to let the movement carry sound, crossing the room in 2 quiet steps until he reached the window, not opening it, just placing his hand lightly against the frame as if it could tell him more than his eyes could see. And the night beyond remained dark, empty to anyone who did not know how to look. But Ethan did, and what he saw was not shapes or figures, it was pattern, distance closing in a way that did not belong to chance. And behind him the girl's voice came again, soft but awake now. They are closer. And Ethan did not turn right away, did not answer, because there was nothing to deny in what she said. And after a moment he nodded once, though she could not see it, and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. Stay where you are. And he moved. Then, not in panic, not in haste, but with purpose, crossing to the small shelf near the door where a single oil lamp sat unused, lighting it with a practiced motion and setting it near the back wall. So the room held 2 sources of light now, one near the bed, one farther away, creating space, depth, a way to see without being seen clearly from outside. And when he returned to the center of the room, he paused, looking once more at the girl, who had pushed herself up slightly, her eyes on him, not afraid, not asking, just waiting. And Ethan met that gaze for a brief second before speaking again, his tone unchanged, steady as the ground beneath them. No matter what you hear, You stay inside." And she nodded once, small but certain, like she had already decided the same thing before he said it. And that was when Ethan reached for the door again, not to open it fully, not yet, just enough to test the night. The hinges barely whispering as it shifted an inch, and the air that slipped through carried something new with it, something colder, something that did not belong to the quiet land he knew. And he closed it again just as softly, his expression unreadable, but his decision already set. And outside, beyond the reach of lantern light and human certainty, the distance between them and whatever followed had grown shorter still, and this time, it was not just the ground that felt it. The second lamp changed the room in a way only a careful eye would notice. Shadows now split instead of gathered, angles softened, edges harder to read from the outside, and Ethan stood between those two quiet circles of light like a man measuring more than space, his gaze moving from the door to the window and back again, mapping out not just what he could see, but what he could not. And the rhythm beyond the walls had settled into something clearer now, no longer a suggestion, no longer something a man could dismiss as wind or distance. It was there, patient, deliberate, closing in the way a decision does when it has already been made. And behind him the girl shifted slightly on the bed, the blanket falling just enough to reveal her hand again, still wrapped around that silver chain. And Ethan noticed it without turning, because some details did not need sight to be understood. They carried their own weight in the room, and he spoke without looking at her, his voice low and even. "How many?" And there was a pause, not long, just long enough to show she was not guessing, and then she answered, "More than 2, less than 10. And Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but it settled something in him. Because numbers like that were not chaos. They were intention, and intention could be met, could be answered, if a man chose his ground well enough. And he stepped toward the table, reaching for the tin cup, turning it slowly in his hand like he was thinking about something else entirely. But his mind was already moving ahead, placing each piece where it needed to be, and he set the cup down closer to the bed, a quiet gesture that did not ask for anything. Just place something within reach, and the girl watched it. Then him, and for a moment there was something in her expression that shifted, not fear, not relief, something quieter, something like recognition of a pattern she had seen before, and Ethan felt it without naming it. That strange understanding that sometimes passed between people who had both seen too much too early. And he turned toward the back wall, checking the second lamp, adjusting it just enough so the flame steadied, not brighter, just cleaner, because clarity mattered more than light. And when he spoke again, it was not to her this time, but to the room itself, as if saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking never could. "They are not here for noise." And the girl answered softly, "No." And that single word settled everything else into place, because it meant patience, it meant waiting, it meant whatever was outside had no reason to rush. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling once before stilling again, and he moved back toward the chair, not sitting this time, just resting his hand against its back, grounding himself in something solid, something known. And the silence stretched again, but it was different now, no longer empty, no longer uncertain. It was full, dense with everything neither of them was saying. And then, from somewhere beyond the far side of the shack, came a sound that did not belong to wind or wood, a soft shift, deliberate enough to carry meaning. And Ethan's head tilted slightly, just enough to catch it, his body still, his breath even, and the girl's fingers tightened around the chain once more, not in panic, but in readiness. And Ethan spoke again, quieter than before, almost like a thought that had decided to become a voice. "They think we will wait. And after a moment," the girl answered, "they always do." And that was when Ethan finally turned to face the door fully, not reaching for it yet, not stepping toward it, just standing there, square and still, as if the space between him and whatever stood beyond that would had already been claimed. And for the first time since the night began, there was no hesitation left in him, no question, no second thought, just a quiet certainty settling into place, the kind that did not come from confidence, but from choosing a line and deciding not to step back from it. And outside, just beyond the reach of light and human voice, the waiting shifted once more, not closer, not farther, but different, like something had just realized the door it had come for was not going to open the way it expected. The stillness inside the shack did not break, but it shifted, tightening in a way that made every small sound carry farther than it should. The faint crackle of the lantern, the soft brush of fabric as the girl adjusted her grip on the chain, the quiet weight of Ethan's breath as he stood facing the door, and outside. Whatever had been waiting no longer felt distant. It felt present, not seen, not heard in any clear way, but there, just beyond the reach of certainty, and Ethan let that settle. Without reacting, because men who lasted out here knew that reacting too soon was the same as giving something away, and he had nothing left to give, not tonight, not to anyone who had not earned it. And his hand moved once, slow, resting against the wood of the door again, not to open it, not to test it, just to feel it, the grain beneath his palm, the quiet strength of something built to stand between two worlds. And behind him the girl's voice came again, softer now, not warning, not fear, just truth. They are waiting for you to choose. And Ethan did not turn, but the corner of his jaw tightened slightly, a small sign that the words had landed where they needed to, and he answered after a moment, his voice steady, almost calm. I already did. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of that decision, filling the space between them like something solid, something that could not be undone once spoken. And the girl watched him from the bed, her eyes no longer searching, no longer uncertain, just steady, like she had been waiting for that answer without knowing it. And her fingers loosened slightly on the chain, not letting go, but no longer holding it like a lifeline, more like something remembered, something that belonged to a past that had already passed. And Ethan stepped away from the door then, just one pace, enough to stand in the center of the room, where both lights reached him, where he could see every corner and be seen from none clearly. And he spoke again, quieter this time, not to her, not to the night, but to the line he had drawn inside himself. They do not come for nothing. And the girl nodded once, her voice following like a shadow of his thought. No. And that single word carried everything they both understood, that whatever was outside had reason, purpose, something worth the miles and the silence and the waiting. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely there, and moved toward the table again, not in urgency, just in completion, picking up the tin cup and setting it down once more, aligning it with the edge like it mattered, like small order could hold back larger chaos. And then he stopped, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again, not to the door this time, but to the girl, and for the first time since the night began, he looked at her fully, not as something found, not as something to protect, but as someone standing in the same moment he was, carrying her own weight, her own choice. And he gave a slight nod, not asking, not commanding, just acknowledging, and she understood, her posture straightening just a little, her voice quiet but clear. I will stay. And Ethan turned back to the door then, not slowly, not quickly, just with the certainty of a man who had reached the end of thinking and the beginning of action. And outside, as if in answer, the night shifted once more, not louder, not closer in any way a man could prove, but different, like something had just recognized that the waiting was over. And for a brief second, everything held still, the air, the light, the space, between breath and sound. And in that moment, before anything moved, before anything revealed itself, Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had chosen to stand, and did not move at all. The moment stretched thin as wire, quiet but alive, and then it broke not with noise but with presence, a shape forming where there had been nothing before, just beyond the edge of the window where the lantern light faded into darkness. And Ethan did not step forward, did not reach for the door. He simply watched, his breathing even, his stance unchanged, because this was the part most men got wrong, the part where they thought movement meant control. But out here control belonged to the one who could wait longer. And behind him the girl had not moved either, her stillness now matching his, not as fear, not as hesitation, but as understanding. And outside the shape became clearer, not a thread in the way stories told it, not loud or rushing, just a figure stepping into the space between shadow and light, stopping just short of where it could be seen fully, as if respecting a line no one had spoken aloud. And for a long second nothing happened, no voice, no demand, just that quiet, standoff that held more weight than any words could carry, and Ethan let it settle, because silence was not emptiness here. It was language. And then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for the door, not flinging it open, not challenging, just turning the handle with care and easing it forward until the night slipped in around him, cool and steady, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distance. And he stepped out just far enough to stand on the threshold, one foot inside, one foot out, the kind of place where decisions lived, and the figure did not move closer, did not retreat. It simply waited. And when it spoke, the voice was calm, measured, carrying no anger, no urgency, only purpose. The child does not belong to you. And Ethan's gaze did not shift, his voice meeting it with the same quiet weight. She is not yours either. And the words hung there between them, not sharp, not hostile, just true in a way that could not be bent. And the figure inclined its head slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. And for a moment it seemed like the night itself leaned in to listen. And then the voice came again, softer now. You do not understand what she carries. And Ethan felt that settle, felt the meaning press against everything he had chosen. And still he did not step aside, did not ask, because some things did not need understanding to be answered. And behind him, just inside the door, the girl had risen to her feet, not approaching, not hiding, simply standing where the light could reach her, her small figure steady against the glow. And for the first time she spoke into the open air, her voice clear despite its softness. I know what I carry. And that changed something, not in the space, not in the distance, but in the shape of the moment itself. And Ethan did not turn to look at her, but he felt it, that shift from being protected to standing, from being carried to choosing. And the figure outside grew still again, as if measuring that new truth, and the silence returned, deeper now, more deliberate. And then, slowly, the figure stepped back, not in retreat, not in defeat, just in recognition. And the voice came one last time, carried lightly on the night air. Then the choice is yours now. And just like that, the presence began to fade into the dark from where it had come, not hurried, not forced, simply gone in the same quiet way it had arrived. And Ethan remained where he was, the door still open, the threshold still holding him between two worlds. And after a long moment he stepped back inside, closing it gently, the latch settling into place with a soft, final sound. And when he turned, the girl was still standing there, the silver chain no longer clenched in her hand but resting loosely against her palm. And for the first time since he had found her, there was something new in her eyes, not fear, not exhaustion, something steadier, something that had been given back to her without a word. And Ethan nodded once, not as a question, not as an answer, just as acknowledgement of what had changed. And outside, the night did not press in anymore. It simply moved on, leaving behind a quiet that felt different from before, not empty, not waiting, but settled, like something had been decided without anyone raising their voice. The quiet that followed did not feel like relief. It felt like something had stepped aside rather than disappeared, like a door had been closed but not locked. And Ethan stood where he was for a moment longer, his hand still resting near the latch as if the wood could tell him whether the night had truly moved on. And when nothing pressed back, when the air settled into its natural stillness again, he turned slowly, not with tension, not with urgency, just with the measured calm of a man who knew the difference between danger passing and danger ending. And behind him the girl had not changed her position, but something about her had shifted, something subtle, like a weight she had been carrying without showing it had been set down just enough to breathe. And the silver chain in her hand no longer looked like something she was clinging to. It looked like something she was holding by choice. And Ethan took a few quiet steps back into the room, the lantern light catching the lines of his face as he moved, softer now, less guarded. And he stopped near the table, resting his fingers lightly against its edge as if grounding himself again in the small, simple things that made sense. And for a while neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, no longer waiting, just present in the way a calm morning sits over open land before the day begins. And then the girl shifted her gaze from the door to Ethan, her voice coming softer than before but clearer, steadier. They will not come back tonight. And Ethan looked at her then, not questioning, not doubting, just listening, because there was something in her tone that carried more certainty than guesswork, and he gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth in it without needing to test it. And he moved to the chair again, this time lowering himself into it with a quiet exhale, the wood creaking beneath him as if it too was settling after a long stretch of waiting. And he leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting once toward the window, where the darkness now looked like nothing more than distance again, no longer watching, no longer holding shape. And for the first time since he had found her out in the dust, Ethan allowed his shoulders to ease just a fraction, not fully, not completely, but enough to mark the passing of something. And across from him the girl drew the blanket closer around herself, not out of fear, just out of habit, and she looked down at the chain in her hand, turning it slowly so the pendant caught the lantern light. And for a moment it seemed like she was seeing it differently too, not as something tied to what had chased her, but as something that still belonged to her. And Ethan watched that small movement, that quiet shift, and spoke again, his voice lower now, less guarded. "You kept it through all of that." And she nodded once, her fingers tracing the edge of the pendant as she answered, "It is not theirs." And that simple statement carried more weight than any explanation could have, and Ethan understood it without needing more. Because out here ownership was not about possession. It was about what you chose to hold on to when everything else tried to take it from you. And he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees again, his gaze steady on the floor for a moment before lifting back to her. And he said quietly, "Then it stays with you." And the girl looked up at him, something in her expression softening in a way that had not been there before, not quite trust, not yet, but something moving in that direction, and she nodded again, slower this time, as if the words had settled deeper, and the lantern flame flickered once, catching the edge of the room before steadying again, and outside, far beyond the reach of sight, the land lay quiet, undisturbed, as if nothing had passed through it at all. And yet inside that small shack, something had changed in a way neither of them needed to name. And as the minutes stretched into something closer to rest than waiting, Ethan Cole remained where he was, not guarding a door anymore, not measuring distance, just sitting in the same space as a child who was no longer alone. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The night thinned slowly, not all at once, but in layers that peeled back from the horizon until the darkness softened into something less certain, less heavy. And Ethan noticed it the way he noticed everything else, not by watching the sky, but by feeling the land breathe differently beneath it, the air shifting from cold stillness to something that carried the faint promise of morning. And he remained in the chair, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, his eyes no longer fixed on the door or the window, but somewhere in between, where nothing needed guarding anymore. And across from him the girl had finally drifted into sleep, not sudden, not deep at first, but steady enough that her grip on the silver chain loosened completely, letting it rest against the blanket as her hand fell open. And that small detail caught Ethan's attention more than anything else, because it was the first time she had let go of it since he found her, the first time her body had allowed itself to trust the moment she was in. And he watched that for a while, longer than he meant to, not out of concern, but out of something quieter, something he did not name. And the lantern beside her cast a softer glow now, its flame lower, its light warmer, touching the edges of her face in a way that made her look less like someone running and more like someone who had finally stopped. And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him as the tension left his shoulders just enough to matter. And he closed his eyes for a brief second, not sleeping, just resting them, letting the silence settle fully around him without resistance. And when he opened them again, the first line of pale light had begun to stretch across the far edge of the window, faint but real, and the land beyond no longer looked like a place that hid things. It looked like itself again, open, wide, indifferent in the way only the West could be. And Ethan stood then, slow, careful not to disturb the quiet that had taken so long to earn. And he moved to the door, resting his hand against it once more before opening it just a few inches, enough to let the early air slip inside, carrying with it the dry scent of morning. And he stepped out onto the worn boards of the small porch, his boots making the only sound in a world that had not fully woken yet. And he looked out across the land, scanning the distance not for shapes, not for movement, but for the absence of it. And there was nothing there, No sign of what had come in the night, no trace left behind, just the open stretch of earth and sky meeting in quiet agreement. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting that settle into him, not as relief, but as confirmation. And when he stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, the room felt different again, not guarded, not waiting, just lived in, and the girl stirred slightly on the bed, her eyes opening slowly as if she had not expected to wake somewhere safe. And when she saw him there, standing where he had been the night before, something in her expression softened, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that the night had changed more than just the silence. And Ethan nodded once, a simple gesture, not asking, not explaining, just acknowledging that they had both crossed something without speaking it. And she pushed herself up slightly, her hand finding the silver chain again. But this time she did not clutch it. She simply held it, and her voice came quietly, still carrying that steady certainty that had never left her. They will not follow here. And Ethan looked at her, not questioning, not doubting, just accepting the truth in her words the same way he had accepted everything else she had said. And he answered in the same tone he had used all along, low, calm, final, "Then you stay." And the words settled between them not as a suggestion, not as an offer, but as something already decided. And outside, the sun began its slow rise over the land, touching the edges of the world with light that revealed nothing new, only what had been there all along. And inside that small shack, the space between two lives that had once been separate had closed without either of them forcing it, without noise, without demand, just through the quiet act of not walking away. The morning did not rush in. It unfolded, slow and steady, stretching light across the worn floorboards until the shadows pulled back into corners and the small shack became something simpler again, something that belonged to the day instead of the night. And Ethan moved through it without hurry, his steps quiet but purposeful, the kind of movement that came from habit rather than thought. And the girl watched him from the edge of the bed, her posture more upright now, her eyes clearer, as if sleep had not just rested her body but returned something to her that had been missing. And she followed him with her gaze as he poured water into the tin cup again, setting it within her reach without speaking. The same gesture as before, but different now. No longer cautious, no longer testing, just part of a rhythm they had both stepped into without needing to agree on it. And she took the cup, her hand steady, drinking slowly while the light caught the silver chain resting loosely against her wrist, no longer hidden, no longer held tight. And Ethan noticed that change, the way a man notices the weather shifting before the sky shows it. And he nodded slightly to himself before stepping toward the door once more, opening it fully this time, letting the morning air move freely through the space, carrying warmth now instead of cold, carrying the distant sound of wind moving through dry grass. Nothing more, nothing hidden. And he stepped outside again, not to check, not to guard, just to stand, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit rather than concern. And the land answered him with the same quiet openness it always had. No sign of anything that had passed through the night, no trace left behind, as if the darkness had taken its secrets with it. And when he returned inside, the girl had stood up from the bed, her small frame steadier now, her movement slower but more certain, and she looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time in daylight, measuring it not for escape, but for belonging. And Ethan paused just inside the doorway, watching that moment without interrupting it, because he understood something now that he had not before, that this was not about shelter alone, not about protection from something outside. It was about giving space for something inside to settle, to decide whether it could stay. And the girl turned to him then, her voice quiet but no longer distant. "What happens now?" And the question did not carry fear, it carried possibility. And Ethan considered it for a second, not because he did not know, but because he wanted the answer to land where it needed to. And he stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft, final sound. And he said simply, "Now, you learn this place." And she tilted her head slightly, not confused, just listening. And he continued, his voice steady, grounded. "Where the water is, where the shade holds longest, where the wind changes direction." And she watched him as he spoke, her expression shifting in small ways, absorbing each word not as instruction, but as something being offered. And when he finished, She nodded once, slow, thoughtful, like she understood more than he had said. And she took a small step toward the center of the room. Not toward him, not away, just into the space itself. And that was when Ethan saw it clearly. The difference between someone passing through and someone beginning to stay. And he turned then, moving toward the small chest by the wall again, opening it with the same quiet care. And this time he did not hesitate. He reached inside and pulled out a folded piece of cloth, worn but clean, placing it on the table between them. A simple offering, nothing more, and the girl looked at it, then at him, and for a moment the room held that silence again. But it was not the same silence as the night. It was lighter, open, like something waiting to be filled rather than something waiting to happen, and she stepped forward, her hand brushing the edge of the cloth before lifting it gently, holding it as if it meant more than its weight suggested. And Ethan watched that without comment, because he knew better than to explain what did not need words. And outside, the sun climbed higher, spreading light across the land that revealed nothing new, only what had always been there, waiting for someone to see it differently. And inside that small shack, two lives that had crossed by chance now stood on the edge of something quieter, something steadier, not defined yet, not named, but real in the way only simple things ever are, and neither of them moved to change it. The day moved forward without asking permission, the sun climbing higher until the light inside the shack turned from soft gold to something clearer, sharper, revealing every line in the wood, every worn edge of the table, every mark left behind by years of quiet living. And Ethan stepped outside again, not to check the horizon this time, but to begin something else entirely, the kind of work that filled a day without needing to be spoken about. And the girl followed him to the doorway, stopping just at the threshold, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she looked out across the land that had almost taken her, and now somehow held her. And she did not step out right away, not because she was afraid, but because she was learning, measuring the space the way he had told her, where the light fell, where the ground shifted, where the wind carried its direction. And Ethan noticed that pause without turning, a small detail that told him more than words ever could. And he moved toward the water barrel near the side of the shack, lifting the lid and checking the level. A simple task, ordinary, but it carried meaning now, because it was no longer just for him. And after a moment the girl stepped out, her boots touching the dry earth carefully, like someone testing a promise. And she stood there, not close to him, not far, just within the same space. And the air between them held no tension, no expectation, just quiet understanding. And Ethan spoke without looking at her, his voice even, "Sun will be stronger in an hour." And she nodded, her eyes already tracking the way the shadows shifted along the ground. And she answered softly, "Then we use the shade before it moves." And Ethan gave the smallest hint of a nod at that. Not praise, not surprise, just recognition. Because she was not learning from him alone. She was remembering something in herself, something that had been there before the running began. And he walked a few steps farther, checking the fence line, his fingers brushing against the wood posts as if greeting them. And she followed at a distance, not mimicking, not copying, just watching, and then trying, her hand reaching out to touch the same rough surface, feeling its texture, its steadiness. And for a brief moment the scene held something almost unfamiliar to both of them. Not tension, not survival, something quieter, something closer to living. And Ethan stopped near the edge of the property, looking out toward the open land where the horizon stretched wide and empty. And he stood there long enough for the moment to settle fully, before speaking again, this time turning slightly so she could hear him clearly. "Out there, you watch the wind more than the ground." And she looked where he was looking, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to see what he saw. And after a moment she nodded, not fully understanding yet, but beginning to, and that was enough. And they stood there together in silence, not the silence of waiting, not the silence of fear, but the kind that comes when two people share the same space without needing to fill it. And after a while Ethan turned back toward the shack, his steps steady, unhurried, and she followed again, closer this time, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. And when they reached the door, he stepped aside without thinking, giving her the space to enter first, a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but it carried its own meaning. And she paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping inside, her hand brushing the doorframe. again as she passed, and Ethan watched that, the way she moved through the space now, not as someone passing through, but as someone beginning to belong, and he followed her in, closing the door gently behind them. And the sound of it settling into place no longer marked a boundary. It marked a home, and outside the wind moved across the land as it always had, indifferent, endless, carrying nothing of the night before, and inside, without words, without ceremony, something had taken root in its place, something quiet, something steady, something that would not be easily moved. The afternoon light stretched long across the land, turning every shadow into something softer, something that no longer carried questions, and inside the small shack the rhythm of the day had settled into a quiet pattern that did not need to be spoken aloud. Ethan moving with the same steady purpose he always had, the girl following not behind him, not beside him, but within the same space, learning it piece by piece until it no longer felt borrowed, and the hours passed without notice, marked only by the shifting sun and the slow cooling of the air, and by the time the sky began to fade into evening again, there was no tension left in the walls, no trace of the night that had come before, just the simple presence of two lives moving without collision, without hesitation, and Ethan stood near the doorway as the light dimmed, his gaze resting on the horizon out of habit, not expectation. And this time the land answered him with nothing but distance, nothing but the quiet truth it had always held, and he turned back inside without lingering, closing the door behind him not as a barrier, but as a routine, a small act that no longer carried weight. And the girl sat at the table now, the folded cloth he had given her earlier resting beside her, her fingers tracing its edge the same way they had once traced the silver chain. But there was a difference now, something subtle but certain. She was not holding on to it to remember something lost. She was holding it because it belonged. Here, in this moment, in this place, and Ethan paused just long enough to see that before stepping further inside, and for a brief second their eyes met, not as strangers, not as people tied together by circumstance, but as something quieter, something that had formed without being named, and he gave a slight nod, the same simple gesture he had used from the beginning, but it carried something more now, something settled, and she returned it, just as small, just as steady, and outside the first stars began to show themselves against the darkening sky, faint at first, then clearer as the light slipped away completely, and the world did not hold its breath this time, did not wait for something to arrive. It simply continued, as it always had, as it always would. And inside the shack the lantern was lit again, its glow, warm and steady, filling the room without casting long shadows, without leaving space for doubt. And Ethan took his seat in the same chair as the night before, but his posture was different, not rigid, not alert, just present, and the girl remained at the table a moment longer before standing, moving toward the small bed without hesitation, without looking toward the door, without listening for anything beyond the walls, and she lay down, the blanket pulled over her not as protection, but as comfort, and the silver chain rested beside her now, not in her hand, not hidden, just there, a part of her life instead of the center of it. And Ethan watched that for a moment before leaning back slightly, his eyes moving once toward the window, then returning to the room, and the silence that followed was complete, not empty, not heavy, just full in the way a place becomes when it is no longer waiting for something else to define it. And as the night settled once more over the land, there were no footsteps in the distance, no shapes in the dark, no voices carried on the wind. Only the steady breath of two people who had chosen not to walk away. And somewhere between the last light of day and the first quiet of night, something simple had taken hold, something that did not need to be spoken, did not need to be defended, something that would remain long after the desert forgot the footprints that led them here. Because out here, where the land remembers nothing, it is not the noise that lasts, it is the choice to stay.